Hello, friends, and welcome to Jewels of Truth. My name is Daniel Fontenot, and today I'm going to read, as I promised to do, this article by Steve Farrell back in September 6, 2000, entitled The Un-American United Nations. In my last presentation, I spoke about the United Nations. That presentation was entitled The United States Constitution Repudiated. So let's read about the Un-American United Nations. This is exposing that organization. So this is what he says. Like many of you growing up under the tutelage of the public school system and the big three television networks in the 1960s and 1970s, I recall the zealous and reverential treatment afforded the world's eighth wonder, the United Nations. And again, let's remember that this article was written in September 2000, so that's 24 years ago. Its ideals, they said, were homespun American ideals. Its immediate mission, to perpetuate the same across the globe. Its ultimate objective, to bring an end to poverty, prejudice, conflict, and war. Indeed, some envisioned and vigorously proclaimed future life under the United Nations as the last and highest stage of evolutionary man. In textbook and pamphlet, newspaper and film clip, this dream was perpetuated, and many of us, longing for peace and security in the aftermath of 2 consecutive world wars, were swept away with the imagery and emotion of this coming millennial Zion. It would be glorious, so glorious that warning bells should have been broadcast throughout the land, a solemn beware, prior to any casting of votes for or against the UN Charter. But the bells were muffled. The Charter fast-tracked through the U.S. Senate, and today we suffer under our great mistake. Indeed, this very day, September 6, 2000, with 159 heads of state gathering on U.S. soil for a World Millennium Summit, our mistake looms ever larger. The goal of this summit, nothing less than to bring America's leaders to their knees, to vow strict loyalty this day and forever, not to our Constitution, to which they are solemnly bound, but to the only true loyalty, the UN Charter, or what Kofi Annan calls the global soul. We should be alarmed. Compelling evidence accumulated over the years by a few dedicated citizens and watchdog organizations reveals this difficult truth. The UN's idealism is less than ideal. Its similarity and loyalty to the U.S. system, a facade. Its promise for peace and liberty, more a formula for war and tyranny. Its leaders and founders, dedicated socialists and communists. The UN was never intended to be our friend. Yet, in the year 2000, we have a president, a State Department, and 2 presidential candidates collectively converted not to the down-to-earth protection of U.S. sovereignty and liberty under the Constitution as per their oath of office, but to some pie-in-the-sky vision of a borderless, socially conscious world under the United Nations. At such a crossroad, re-exposing the uncomfortable truth about the UN cannot be overdone. The UN is no friend to American ideals. The UN's founders were known communists. If it's true that the personality, purpose, and accomplishments of an organization are highly affected by its leadership, then membership in the United Nations spelled trouble from the start. Of the 17 individuals identified by the U.S. State Department as having helped shape U.S. policy leading to the creation of the United Nations, all but one were later identified as secret members of the Communist Party USA. Joining them at the UN's founding conference were 43 members of the ultra-influential, ultra-pro-socialist, globalist think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations. Of the 43 CFR members having the additional distinction of membership in the Communist Party USA. And importantly, the UN's first Secretary General and orchestrator of the San Francisco Conference was the man later convicted as a Soviet agent, Alger Hiss. Maybe it's Alger Hiss, A-L-G-E-R. Not a good start. Following in the footsteps of that unhallowed class of 46, the ideological makeup of the UN's leadership has been constant. In its 54-year history, all 8 Secretary Generals of the UN have been either dedicated socialists or communists. All 15 of the UN Undersecretary Generals for Political and Security Council Affairs, the UN's military boss, have been communists, all but one from the Soviet Union, Russian Federation, and 2/3 of the membership in the General Assembly, the Security Council, and in the World Court have always been representatives of the socialist and communist nations. Further, the collection of U.S. employees at the UN have not fared well either. Besides the scandal of having American communist Alger Hiss and company as the creators of the UN, a 1952 official Senate investigation into the then 6-year-old United Nations revealed, quote, extensive evidence indicating that there is today in the UN among the American employees there the greatest concentration of communists that this committee has ever encountered, unquote. And these were high officials. 20 years later, the anti-American, anti-freedom flavor of the UN continued unabated, which prompted former UN enthusiast Republican Senator Barry Goldwater to call for U.S. withdrawal from the UN and the restationing of its headquarters to a place, quote-unquote, more in keeping with the philosophy of the majority of its voting members, somewhere like Peking or Moscow, unquote. Yeah, I would agree that really the UN should be either in Peking or Moscow, which today Moscow has changed, I believe, but that's a different story. Things were no different by the 1980s. Republican President Ronald Reagan expressed the same sentiments as Goldwater, adding that the UN was the host of the greatest concentration of spies in the world, and thus he vowed to withdraw the U.S. from the UN. He did boot UNESCO out of the U.S. Which leads to the next reason the U.S. deserves our full measure of scorn. With a lineup of communists, socialists, and spies founding and still running the show at the UN, it seems a bit hard to believe that the political framework created by such notorious figures would be consistent with the American Constitution, isn't it? And there is plenty of proof. The UN's charter is the antithesis of the U.S. Constitution. Its Bill of Rights creates radical new rights to include these: the socialist right to adequate housing, a living wage, rest and leisure, medical care, social services, employment security, sick pay, disability pay, old age security pay, and widow's pay. And I know there are some that might say, well, what's wrong with those things? Well, there's not a thing in the world wrong with them, except that it's not the government's place to provide these things. The family-threatening right for children to possess freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, which has led to children suing their parents in the United States, and the right to privacy, i.e. the right for a child to seek an abortion without parental consent. The sovereignty-destroying right for humans to immigrate and receive welfare services in whatever nation they choose. This article, again, was written 24 years ago. You wonder why, some of you may wonder why we have this immigration problem. The finger is being pointed in this article at the UN. The brainwashing right for students to learn the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Oh, yes, your students, they have the right to learn the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and the statist right for the UN to eradicate any and all rights and freedoms exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. A Soviet Constitution-style proviso to accompany all of these and more Soviet-style rights. Its promotion of democratic institutions is a pretense. Not one UN delegate or official is democratically elected by the people. The 185 national delegates to the General Assembly don't possess real representative power anyway. They may only consider, discuss, advise, or make suggestions to the Security Council. An arrangement similar to the meaningless representation of the American colonies suffered under the British Parliament. Back at its founding. This is similar to the meaningless representation the American colonies suffered under the British Parliament. However, the 15 member nations of the Security Council, 5 permanent members and 10 rotating, do have substantial power and are unchecked in this power by election or constitutional constraint, which leads to the next point. Its separation of powers is an illusion. The UN appears to have 3 separate branches of government, with the General Assembly and the Security Council being symbolic of our House and Senate, the Secretary General symbolic of our President, and the World Court symbolic of our Supreme Court. But as already demonstrated, the General Assembly has only advisory powers. The Secretary General is but the chief administrative officer of the UN, who, like the General Assembly, may only bring to the attention of the Security Council matters he deems important, while the World Court is subject to the Security Council's absolute veto upon any of its decisions. Furthermore, the Security Council may, if it so chooses, judge any legal matter it sees fit, only being advised to take into consideration that legal disputes should be, as a general rule, be referred to the International Court of Justice. Thus, all powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, reside in the Security Council, with the 5 permanent members being the real power center, since the non-permanent members serve but 2 years and lack absolute veto power. Stunningly, in the serious matter of sanctions or war, once initiated, the General Assembly is even stripped of its petty right to consult with the Security Council unless the Council requests their input. Additionally, regional, military, and economic alliances such as NATO, the EU, and this next one is, it reads ASEAN, A-S-A-I-N. I guess that stands for that part of the world, and NAFTA, are all, by their own treaty law and the UN Charter, which authorized their existence, subject to the rule of the UN Security Council, to whom they must report all actions under contemplation, to whom they must seek the approval for any sanctions they intend to impose, and to whom they must bow in obeisance when the Security Council deems it necessary to delegate out enforcement actions. Thus, regional arrangements are part of the UN web and subject to the centralized control of the few men who make up the permanent membership of the Security Council. Montesquieu taught, and the founders concurred and improved on the principle that the concentration of all power, legislative, executive, and judicial, in one office is the very definition of tyranny. Let me repeat that. Montesquieu taught, and the founders concurred and improved on the principle that the concentration of all power, legislative, executive, and judicial, in one office is the very definition of tyranny. So what then is the Security Council but a budding, 5-headed world tyrant? Its National Sovereignty Protection Clause was and is a ploy. Article 2, verse 7, which forbids the UN from intervening, quote, in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, unquote, was inserted as an afterthought to calm the fears of conservatives in the U.S. Senate 50 years ago. The clause offers no such security. Every other clause, every other sentence, every other word in the UN Charter calls for international oversight over every possible affair on the planet. Even the Sovereignty Clause has a mile-wide escape hatch which reads, quote, this principle shall not prejudice the application of the enforcement measures under Chapter 7, unquote. Chapter 7, Articles 39 through 42 include the Security Council's power to determine the existence of any threat to international peace and security, and then to take whatever actions as may be necessary, such as interruption of economic relations and of rail, sea, air, postal, telegraphic, radio, and other means of communications, and or action by air, sea, or land forces. Chapter 7, Article 50 even gives the Security Council the power to wage war or impose sanctions on non-member nations. If that isn't the power to intervene in internal matters, what is? Evidence enough, says former top communist member Joseph Z. Kornfetter, that it's clearly recognizable that the UN blueprint is a communist one. The UN has not protected sovereignty nor promoted freedom. The UN's history confirms the above claim. The UN is the enemy of national sovereignty. A few examples include the World Trade Organization, another regional arrangement under the UN Charter. For instance, usurps the right of nations to establish their own foreign commerce policy via 40,000 pages of regulations, scores of regulatory agencies, and its use of sanctions against violators, proving itself the enemy, not the friend of free trade. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, also part of the UN circle, routinely blackmail client nations to alter internal policies via structural loans. Typically, they demand the establishment of planned economies, the nationalization of utilities, major industries, and banking, the creation of export-dependent economies, and the implementation of national birth control policies. In a nutshell, in the name of fiscal responsibility, they subtly push socialist-based economic, social, and political philosophies which stifle economic independence and foster greater dependence on the UN, its banks, and the international community. The UN's military uses brute force to decide the fate of wars between sovereign nations and our internal warring factions, as it did in the Belgium Congo, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Somalia, Bosnia, and Haiti. Presently, the UN is engaged in 14 quote-unquote peacekeeping operations, wars, enlisting troops from 77 nations, world wars, and has waged war 62 times in its brief 56 years of existence. Wow. Some peace organization, more quietly, it has murdered hundreds of thousands through trade embargoes, 500,000 children in Iraq alone 24, robbing innocent civilians of the necessities of life, all because the UN denies the sovereign right of nations like Iraq to maintain a modern national defense system. Not surprisingly, the UN opposes the building by the United States of a 21st century missile defense system to protect our sovereignty, even while the UN ignores continued Russian and Chinese targeting of major U.S. cities, continued Russian and Chinese missile modernization programs, and continued Russian and Chinese first strike doctrines. And as for respecting sovereignty and human rights, consider this. One of the major goals of the Millennial Summit is a call for the establishment of a permanent standing UN army on U.S. soil, which Clinton appallingly supports, who will go to war at the whim of the UN so that the UN may never again have to submit to the cumbersome process of gaining approval of the sovereign nations and their peoples who must fight, die, and pay for these wars. The UN's war on sovereignty continues. UNESCO and the World Health Organization have wormed their way into member governments, promoting sex education, homosexuality as normal and healthy, abortion, the right of a child to privacy, population control, and scientific breeding. Why isn't it that the United States government and these conservative, talk show hosts and politicians, why aren't they pointing the finger at the UN as where this is coming from? The United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, I guess it's called, first led by passionate socialist and New Ager Maurice Strong, has set fear-driven environmental standards which are currently being implemented in the United States and many other quote-unquote free nations. Targeted is the U.S., who is the guilty party that must pay the world's environmental bill. Aligned with that charge are calls for the worldwide redistribution of wealth and technology. And because environmental threats are in this fanatical view, the number one international security concern, national sovereignty, has been identified by UNEP as a barrier that must be breached. Truth is, there are so many regulatory agencies listed on the UN's homepage, branching off in so many different directions with sub-agencies and sub-agencies of sub-agencies that are designed to interfere with the sovereignty of nations, that one could spend a week of research trying to come up with an honest head count. However, as part of the year 2000 summit kickoff, the UN has several more major sovereignty-destroying proposals aimed straight at the United States. Number one, the elimination of the absolute veto power of the United States, which means that two communist states, Russia and China, and one socialist-leaning member of the EU, England, or more especially France, by majority vote can outgun the United States in the Security Council and impose laws upon us over our protest. Number two, an enlargement of the powers of the World Court, who by judicial review could do more damage in 1 year to our Constitution than the Supreme Court ever did in decades. Number three, an expanded role for the UN in the regulation of international commerce and as an overseer to individual corporations. Number four, a new and dangerous power to tax the world and thus indefinitely fund the growth of world government. Number five, blatant confessions by the UN's chief Annan that the continued protection of national sovereignty is obsolete and dangerous. The UN aids communists and attacks non-communists and capitalists. In the 1950s, the UN undermined freedom's victory in Korea by accepting rules of engagement and passing on secrets to Russia and China, which made victory impossible for South Korea and the United States. They then chose silence and inaction while Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary, crushing freedom fighters who fought these tanks with sticks and stones. In the 1960s, the UN invaded Katanga in the Belgium Congo and foiled that province's quest for independence from communist murderer and torturer Patrice Lumumba, and likewise declared tiny Rhodesia a threat to international peace, enabling pro-communist terrorist Robert Mugabe to seize control. Both the result of an official UN anti-colonialist policy which in the name of democracy spread communism throughout Africa, Asia, and the Americas from the 1950s clear up into the 1980s. Showing their pro-communist partnership, Russia, China, and Cuba's influence on all of these resolutions was perennially and officially denied by the UN, who dubbed all communist revolutions as spontaneous, quote unquote, uprisings of the poor and politically ostracized. In the 1970s, the UN admitted mass murderer Red China, despite the charter rule to admit peace-loving nations only. They added insult to injury by granting China the power and prestige of Permanent Security Council status, while simultaneously kicking out Free Taiwan. They winked while Security Council member the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, but then suppressed IMF loans to Nicaragua and Iran at key moments in their battle against communist-backed revolutions in their nations, citing, quote-unquote, human rights violations. In the 1980s, the UN organized an international boycott against South Africa, which favored the Soviet, the PLO, and Cuban-backed African National Congress, which in turn toppled the South African government, the key UN anti-colonial victory in Africa, leading to an immediate turn toward socialism. His first act was to socialize medicine, foreign aid, reverse discrimination, and a nullification of a promised coalition government. Amazingly, the UN pushed for and enforced the boycott, even though Mandela, upon release from prison, publicly declared his loyalty to and the ANC's alliance with the South African Communist Party. In the 1990s, the UN disarmed anti-communist forces in Nicaragua, imposed economic sanctions on Iraq for invading old Soviet friend Kuwait, hypocritically sent annual foodstuffs to communist North Korea, imposed coalition government on Muslims with communists in Bosnia, opposed U.S. sanctions against Cuba, indicted President Pinochet for his suppression and imprisonment of communists in Chile, and continues to support the right of Russia and China to suppress liberty in Chechnya and Taiwan. The UN is a fraud, and yet it continues unabated. Soviet dictator Vladimir Lenin, in his work Imperialism and World Economy, predicted a day of capitalistic imperialism wherein a new social order would be introduced under which the leadership of a single world trust would swallow up all enterprises and all states without exception. Under this system, capitalism would move toward a mixture of private capital and social production, that form of socialism called fascism or state monopoly capitalism. But before this melting of economic, political, and national systems finished its job of world union, he predicted, imperialism will inevitably explode, and capitalism will turn into its opposite, communism. A dire prophecy, and one which should focus our attention on the real, more subtle communist threat in the world today, the United Nations. Earl Browder, General Secretary of the Communist Party USA, admitted in his book Victory and After that, quote unquote, that the American communists worked energetically and tirelessly to lay the foundation of the United Nations, which we were sure would come into existence, unquote. And that, quote, the United Nations is the instrument for victory, the victory of communism, unquote. Let us hope he was dreaming, and that millions of Americans will wake up to the fact that they were lied to by their state-run schools, by UN-generated pamphlets and by the big three networks. Sensible and freedom-loving Americans should realize that we can do better in our goals to achieve peace and liberty than provide moral support, cash, and housing for such a sham for liberty and peace as the United Nations. And the editor's note here, I'm going to read the editor's note. The previous article was thoroughly footnoted. We removed the footnotes because of our limited space. If you desire to view these, write or give us a call and we will send you the unedited article. The article becomes more significant when you understand the information in the book Ecclesiastical Megalomania, which I have read parts of on this channel. Even without the spiritual viewpoint which Seventh-day Adventism places upon end-time events, a person would be correct in opposing the endeavors of the UN to implement communism upon the entire world. A more important recognition is found when we recognize that the philosophical foundation of the UN, along with the political machine it has developed, is nothing more than the beast with 10 horns that has been ruled, that will be ruled by the whore of Rome for a short period of time at the end of the world in fulfillment of Revelation 17. You need to read the book Ecclesiastical Megalomania. I want to read one more thing here in closing before we end this article. In the book, The Great Controversy, somewhere around page 585, and I have read the statement here before. Yes. Page 588 of the book Great Controversy. The Protestants of the United States will be foremost in stretching their hands across the gulf to grasp the hand of spiritualism. Okay. The United Nations is the embodiment of spiritualism. It is atheistic, it is communist, it is paganistic, all in one. Let me read the entire paragraph. Through the two great errors, the immortality of the soul and Sunday sacredness, Satan will bring the people under his deceptions. While the former lays the foundation of spiritualism, the latter creates a bond of sympathy with Rome. The Protestants of the United States will be foremost in stretching their hands across the gulf to grasp the hand of spiritualism. They have done that to a large extent just in the formation of the UN. And in case some of you don't realize it, the United Nations building, the property upon which the United Nations building is set on, is not even owned by the United States, even though it is located in New York. They will reach over the abyss to clasp hands with the Roman power, and under the influence of this threefold union, United States, apostate Protestants, the UN, and Roman Catholics, this country will follow in the steps of Rome in trampling on the rights of conscience. Well, dear friends, I know this was a long read here. I didn't comment a whole lot, and it was difficult to concentrate, but nevertheless, we made it. So if you found this worthwhile to be sent to those far and wide who are searching for the truth today, then tap that like button at the bottom of this video, and if you have any questions or comments, then feel free to post those also at the bottom of this video. And if you haven't subscribed, we would highly encourage you to do so. Thank you for joining us here at Jewelers of Truth. We hope and pray that you will have a good day in the Lord.